Okay. Good afternoon. This is Professor Tafuro, and I'm going to share with you some of the important elements of Chapter 2, the building blocks of language. So in this chapter, we go into a little bit more detail, looking at the components of language primarily, where we did look at those in Chapter 1. They were introduced, but now we're going to look at each of these components in a bit more depth. And so conversation starts off looking at phonological development, okay? So just to review, we know that every language has a relatively small number of meaningful sounds. We call those sounds phonemes. So for example, in English, we have around 43 individual sounds, okay? P, B, right? So distinct from letters or graphemes, phonemes is the term that we use when we're talking about the sounds that are produced, okay? These individual sounds are really defined as speech sounds or elements that signal a contrast in meaning. So what we mean by that is, for example, we might have the word low and we have the word row. So just changing from the O sound to the sound, we're now signaling a change in meaning. Similarly, liver, river, okay? The meaning of these two words is very different simply because we are using a different phoneme in the word initial or start position. And that's what we mean when we say that speech sound or a phoneme, we're defining as something that signals a contrast in meaning, okay? We are going to be looking at three main things in this section of Chapter 2. We're going to be thinking about sort of how we internally represent and produce sounds to start. So just to give you a quick overview, phonological or sound representation, okay, is how that how a sound sounds to us in our heads quietly. So if I showed you the letter B and said, tell yourself quietly to yourself, say this sound, you would all hear B without producing anything. That's an internal representation, okay? And that's an important point to remember. So what's interesting is that sometimes children have internal representations, even though they don't have the motor skills to produce a specific or given sound. For example, if you think about the two words shine and sign, right? So the young child, 3 years old, probably very young 3-year-old, says we need to sign the mirror. And the adult says, sign the mirror. And the child says, no, we need to shine the mirror. But that's what he was thinking. But he emphasized the S sound, thinking that it sounded like a sh. So the fact that he heard the difference when the mom or the adult said sign and not shine tells us a couple of things. It tells us that he can hear or perceive the difference between these two minimal pairs, sh and s, right? Because when he intended to say shine, and the adult imitated it as a s sound, he corrected them and said no. And what did he do? He tried to produce the sh sound. That was his internal representation, but his production in that moment didn't match his internal representation. So that's an important point to consider, that they're different. We're going to talk about those again in a minute. And then the other really big part of phonological development and what's happening really primarily during the first year of life is we're really developing a sensitivity to what we call phonotactic rules, or the rules around how sounds can be combined, in essence. Okay, so let's take a look in more detail. When we think about phonological building blocks, there's a few things that the chapter highlights. One has to do with certain cues that are segmenting the stream of speech. So in other words, we need to know, or we want to, in order to develop the phonological skills that we need to be able to know where sounds are, where syllables are, and the boundaries of those syllables, where words end and start, so the boundaries of words, all of those we come to know and be able to identify using what we call prosodic cues, okay? So the intonation or the stress pattern in a language that lets infants, really young infants, break into the speech stream. And what it does, it helps them to compare and contrast phonotactic cues or the rules around how sounds are combined. So for example, let's say we have in English, which we do, a strong, weak stress pattern, okay? So this word here is produced little. So the strong, the emphasis happens in the beginning of the word on the first syllable, okay? Same with the next word, grammar, okay? Grammar. So the emphasis is happening. So we call that the prosodic stress. At the word level, we call it stress. At a sentence level, we call this rhythmic change in whether it's loudness or pitch or how long we say certain vowels, for example. We call it intonation at the sentence level. So my first name is Lisa, right? So I'm Lisa because that's the stress pattern in English, as opposed to in French, I would be Lisa. Okay. And it's that stress pattern, believe it or not, that infants really become pretty good at identifying. And then they use those, they use that knowledge to help them decide what's the beginning of a word, what's the end of a word, and then where does a brand new word begin. Okay. And that's what this conversation here is about. And you can read through some of that. Another thing that we just kind of mentioned that infants are doing is developing their phonemic inventory. And that's what we're talking about, sort of their internal representations, or what we call their phonological knowledge, right? By definition, phonological knowledge is the knowledge of these internal representations, right? And we're talking about, of course, their native language, or if a child is learning two languages at once, then of those two languages. But the phonological knowledge, or knowledge about those internal representations, should be contrasted with phonological production, right? Being able to produce phonemes. So if we go back, the phonemes of the language. So if we go back to that initial shine sign example, we know that in that case, that child has the phonological knowledge of these two contrasting sounds, right? But from a production standpoint, that child isn't able to distinguish the production of those two sounds. There was no SH, and in essence, there was no sh in that child's phonemic inventory, if you will. Okay. And there really is sort of an expected developmental milestone, if you will, right? That there are certain consonants from a production standpoint, that is, consonants that emerge early on versus consonants that come in a little bit later. And I think if we take a look at figure 2.1, which is on the next page, we can see that this is 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, and 8 years. So children are still developing, right? Typical development is such that there are certain sounds, some of these harder zh, ch sounds. These are happening at a probably much later age than you would imagine. We call this the order of acquisition. And in this case, it's for English consonant phonemes or sounds. Okay, so that's really what the phonemic inventory is talking about. The section on phonological awareness, right? If we click in here and take a look at the definition, awareness is the ability to focus on the phonemes or the sounds that make up the syllables in the words. But what's really important here is this idea that sometimes the awareness is both implicit and explicit. Sometimes it's just implicit, meaning you're aware, but you don't really realize that you're aware. And let me give you an example. So here are some of the things that children do that's considered phonological awareness. When they can count syllables, when they can detect rhymes, when they can tell you what the first sound of a word is, right? This is really the difficulties progressing here from easier to more difficult. So a phonological awareness task that I do with my college students in class, in person, is ask them to count the number of phonemes, as an example, in the word axe, like I'm going to cut the wood with the axe. And generally students think about the sounds AX, the letters, I should say AX, and so they answer 2 phonemes. But really, there's three phonemes in that word, because if you think about it, it would be a, k, and s. So in that case, the phoneme counting would result in three phonemes. But a lot of us as adults even get that wrong. And how is that possible? Well, because we have the knowledge, but the knowledge is implicit. It's not anything that we have access to that we can talk about sometimes, right? I remember when my daughter was very young, maybe 2.5, we'd be sitting in traffic, and to pass time, we play the clapping game, and I'd ask her to count, how many claps in the word elephant. And she'd clap her hands, and then she'd say three. But she wouldn't be able to tell me like what a syllable was at that time, right? So these are just some elements of what we call phonological awareness. And again, the key is that it can be, and often is at a young age, very implicit. And that's a little bit different, right, from this idea of what we call phonemic awareness, which is a very explicit awareness of the individual phonemes of a language, okay? And so children generally don't exhibit phonemic awareness until much, much later, following their phonological awareness, okay? I think it's important to note that literacy success is very much rooted in children's phonological awareness. So if you go ahead and work on this skill set and improve a child's ability to do all of these things, their ability to learn to decode and to read also improves in a correlated way. Okay. So there are certain influences on phonological development. I want you to spend more time on the previous sections, but here, obviously, the language that you're exposed to is going to influence your sound development or your phonology, the sounds of your language. The linguistic experience that you have, so how often you're hearing language, how often you're exposed to it, is going to obviously impact your phonological development. And moving on from there, we're going to look at the second component, okay, which is morphological development. It would be great if you could watch some of the videos that are illustrating some of the points being made here, okay? We want to understand first a definition of morphology and morphological development in a way that makes sense, right? So morphological development has to do, again, with this internalization of rules, this implicit sort of awareness that there are certain rules that govern how words are structured, right? So we know there are very certain combinations of sounds, we'll call them syllables, that could be the beginning of a word. Then there are certain combinations that qualify and follow the rules that could be at the end of a word. But words are very much rule governed. So the structure of words, that is, are very much rule governed. Morphemes, by definition, are the smallest unit of meaning. The idea that it's the smallest unit of meaning just means that a morpheme in and of itself cannot be broken down. If you break that morpheme down, it will lose meaning. So I could say something like walked, and that word has two morphemes. It has both a free morpheme, walk, and the past tense morpheme, which is called a bound morpheme, because it only carries meaning when bound to the free morpheme, ed, which signifies the past tense. Again, the structure, right? Morphological development is learning how there are rules that govern how this word is structured. So there's not going to be many young children who put an ed at the front of a word, in the beginning of a word. Generally, it's going to come at the end. What they might do to prove this point is say something like goad, right? Because what they're doing is acquiring the word structure to communicate past tense about something that happened in the past, right? Goad. The word is went. We happen to have what we would call sorry, I'm having a moment. An irregular past tense form, but the idea is that children are learning this rule and they're learning the structure. So what they're doing is applying it. So we often hear children say goad, but we would never hear a child put the ed before the go, right? Because that is not the part of the internalization of the rules that they're learning about how words and the structure of words are governed. And so that's an example, a good example actually of a building block of a morphological development and morpheme. So when we think about what the building blocks of morphology or morphological development are, they're generally these what we call grammatical morphemes, right? We also call them inflectional morphemes. And then the other group of morphemes are called derivational morphemes. So a grammatical morpheme or inflectional morpheme is the unit of language that's added to the word to allow some grammatical precision, if you will. So plural S tells us, well, the meaning is the same dog, but plural S is saying that we have two or more of those dogs. We have possessive S indicating possession of something. Past tense, present progressive, meaning there's some action happening now, jumping, for example. Okay, all of these grammatical morphemes are called bound morphemes. And in contrast, the other morphological building block, if you will, are derivational morphemes. Okay, so derivational morphemes are going to be more advanced things like prefixes and suffixes. So let's take another look real quick. Here we have in the grammatical morpheme section, which we call also inflectional morphemes. These are primarily bound morphemes, right? We want to make sure that we can define a bound morpheme. Can't be freestanding, can't be produced by itself. And we can't walk around and tell someone ing. Doesn't make any sense. A free morpheme, in contrast, is a unit of meaning, smallest unit of meaning, that can stand alone. So any word that can't be broken down is a free morpheme if it carries meaning. Okay, so read through that section. That should give you some context. And here's a list, and you want to become very familiar with this list, because not only that it's showing us what these morphemes are, it's telling us about the anticipated age that children begin to master these morphemes and produce these morphemes. They're understanding them at a much earlier. When we say grammatical morphemes acquired, this is when they're using them. So that's about production. Okay. So the other idea, as we mentioned, is this idea of a derivational morpheme. So when we look at prefixes or suffixes, these are a bit more advanced, because sometimes what these derivational morphemes do is they not only give some precision to a word, but they actually change, let's say, the grammatical category of the word, right? We could say the word dance, which is a verb, but if we add the suffix to the word dance, er, and we say dancer, now we're talking about a noun. So that's a tremendous amount of knowledge, right? That we need in order to be able to, I guess, functionally use a derivational morpheme like er. We have to have the intention of changing a verb to a noun. Okay. So let's see. Moving on, here's a list or a table of some of those common derivational morphemes, otherwise known as prefixes and suffixes. And again, the language that you're exposed to, your first language or your native language, is very much going to influence your morphological development. Some languages have hundreds and hundreds of grammatical or inflectional morphemes. A language like Turkish, for example, has many, many more inflectional morphemes as compared to English. Okay, so let's take a peek so you can read through all of this on your own. Dialects are also going to dictate how we use, right? So there's all different dialects of English that are spoken in this country, all of which follow a set of morphological rules, if you will. There isn't one dialect that is more correct. There are dialects that are expected in different contexts, in different places, in different situations, and your ability to be able to shift in and out of which dialect you produce and which rules you follow is actually quite a skill. Okay, so moving on from morphology, we're going to take a look at syntax, right? So what is syntax? Syntactic development. Syntactic development has to do, again, with our developing internalization, right? That we're beginning to implicitly understand, become familiar with, and then use, of course, produce the rules that govern not how words are organized, but rather how words are organized into a sentence. So this is about how sentences are organized. Okay. So syntax, the rules governing how sentences are organized. So what are the things, sort of the building blocks, they keep using this term, right? What are the things or the tools that children acquire? What are the aspects of syntax that children acquire early on that help them to develop their syntax? So this is actually a very interesting and important paragraph right here. The grammatical system of a child, right, acquired from birth is a discrete combinatorial system consisting of a finite number of discrete elements that allow the child to produce an infinite number of sentences. So if you're reading this, likely if this is your first time being introduced to the idea of syntax, that might be a little bit overwhelming, even a little frustrating. So I just kind of want to explain what we're talking about here. A discrete unit is something that's separate from something else. So a p is discrete from a b is discrete from the sound m, for example. What we can do is take all of these individual sounds, and there's a finite number of sounds in English, a set number. We have about 43, but we can combine them in an almost infinite number of ways to create an infinite number of words, in essence, right? As long as we follow the rules governing how those sounds can be combined, phonology, then we can create as many words and give those words meaning. And we see that happen. New words are created, if you will, every day, right? Like the term Google started off maybe as a name, but somebody had to name it. And now it's a verb to Google something, right? So that word didn't exist before. What we did is we put the sounds together in a meaningful way, and in a way that followed the rules of English. So the same is true for syntax, right? So here what we're doing, we're talking about this finite number of elements of a sentence, meaning we have to have the subject, we have to have the verb, we can have prepositions and conjunctions and all these elements, right? Different words fulfill those different categories. And as long as we follow the structure or the sequence or the order of those different categories, we can create, right, with a finite number of words. Let's say we have, I don't know, 60,000 words in the English language that we use on a regular basis. From those 60,000 words, we can really produce an infinite number of sentences. And that's what this is telling us, where it's a combinatorial system. We're combining phonemes to create words, or morphemes. We're combining morphemes to create words. We're combining words to create syntax or sentences. Okay. So as children become equipped and learn this syntactic combinatorial system in particular, there are 3 achievements that happen. Okay. Their utterances get a little bit longer. That's letter A. They begin to use different sentence modes. That's letter B. And then they'd start to develop what we call complex syntax. So no longer just using simple sentences. So what is utterance length? Well, you can see the MLU is a calculation, and it's basically looking at how many morphemes a child is producing per line or utterance on average. So here in this example, you can see that the MLU is looking at, let's say, a transcript of utterances, and we're going to count how many morphemes occur in each utterance or for each line. And then if there are 50 lines, we're going to divide the total by 50. And that gives us an estimate about, on average, how long or how many morphemes are produced in an utterance. We know that younger children are producing shorter utterances. Older children are producing longer utterances. And we talk about length, again, I went back here, we talk about length as the MLU, or the mean length of utterance. So sentence modes are another way that children can show their sort of burgeoning syntactic knowledge, okay? So for example, most preschoolers are going to use a whole lot of declarative sentences, statements in essence, right? Subject, verb, object, right? Subject, verb, then adverb, phrase. But what we're also knowing is that when they start to produce negative sentence modes, right? So the modality changes from a declarative or a statement to a negative sentence. What they have to do is they have to have knowledge of where to insert the negative, right? So look, there's the not. Here's the negative. It's not just at the beginning. They have to know where to insert that negative. And that knowledge of where to insert it is syntactic knowledge. So producing negative sentences correctly tells us they're developing some knowledge of syntax or competence. And an interrogative is the same idea. It's taking a sentence, but it's asking a question, okay? So if I wanted to use a declarative here, I would say that light is green. But to ask a question, I have to say, why is that light green? So what am I doing? I'm changing the word order. What is word order? And the rules that dictate or govern how words are combined, that's syntax. So for me to be able to go from a statement or a declarative to an interrogative or a question, I need syntactic knowledge to do that. And that's why the modalities is evidence of growing and maturing and developing syntactic knowledge, right? Here's another example. The declarative utterance, he is sleeping. The interrogative or question form of that is he sleeping? So we see that the word order shifts. Okay, so if you read through this, you'll understand now what that means. And finally, we're talking about linking phrases and clauses to produce complex syntax. So I'd like you to read through this so that you can understand these very well-formed complex sentences that have combinations of phrases, clauses, conjunctions, right? All of which are organizing and structuring, right, internally in the sentence, a vast number of elements. And again, that's evidence of growing syntactic knowledge. Okay, so here we have age ranges for anticipated MLUs when they're measured. Okay, so a child in Brown stage 2 has an MLU on average of 2 to 2.49. So what that means is they're using 2 to 2.5 morphemes per utterance on average. And you can read the description to the right. Okay, and here's an example of some of the syntactic features that are now beginning to develop early on, and that evidence or are evidence of complex syntax. And here's some of those examples. Okay, what influences syntactic development? Not only the language that's being spoken, right? Different languages have different grammatical structures or sequences or the order in which words are used in a sentence. Parents, what we call child-directed speech, or parents' language to children, teachers' language to children, caregiver in general. The more complex the caregiver's language production is, the more complex we see a real correlation between adult language, adult grammar, and child grammar, the developing of grammar in a child's language. All right, and here you see the correlation here. And this has to do with lower SES and higher SES families. We also see here the proportion, right? So this is sort of a linear, this line kind of looks like this. So the proportion of complex sentences produced by the child at school is going to be, right, in line or correlate with by mom. Low child, low mom. High child, high mom. Okay, so you have to be able to read that graph. And finally, we're going to take a look, actually not finally, but next we're going to take a look at semantic development. Okay, so semantic development, by definition, refers to an individual's learning and storing of the meaning of words. So semantics isn't just about words, but semantics is about word meaning. And I want you to really pay attention to that. So a person's mental lexicon or their vocabulary system is how they convey meaning, really. So the words are simply symbols right? But the meanings of the words are what we're very much interested in. And that meaning has to do with, is in part of semantic building block. So the more words a child has, right, the more semantic knowledge that child has, right? So acquiring the mental lexicon of about 60,000 words between infancy and adulthood. So that was the number we just used. Another building block is that children are really what we see happening, or young children are learning new words very rapidly. And then they're organizing these words into what we would call semantic networks, or groups of words that really have some kind of relationship between them. Sometimes we see some children demonstrate what we call a vocabulary spurt. So here is a child's vocabulary. And we see that's from the time they're learning, or from the time they're producing, let's say 16, 21, 26 words, all of a sudden we see this huge growth per in terms of the rate of their wording, of their learning. So we really see this big increase in slope. And we also see the same in the rate of word learning, how fast they learn words and the number of vocabulary words that they acquire. Okay. So we want to think about semantics and lexicon, not just about how many, but also the taxonomy. So they refer to the semantic taxonomy, which is something that differentiates words on the basis of their semantic role, right? So for example, noun, a specific noun like mom or Lisa, a general noun like lady or animal, action words or verbs, modifiers, which are really adverbs and adjectives, and personal social words. So we really like to look to see that children are developing a whole host of these different categories of words. Okay, and here we know there are some percentages of what we expect preschool children, young children, to have in their vocabulary. It's also interesting to think about how children are developing new words, right? And there's a few things that are influencing how quickly they're developing new words. I remember before I was really teaching this content and I had my daughter and she was an infant, and I remember thinking to myself, I wonder how many times she needs to hear a word before she would be able to use the word. And in some cases, it was just once. If there was a real strong context to help her acquire and understand the meaning of that word, and the word was simple enough to produce, then after just one single exposure, she would be able to convey that meaning using that single word. And it was really pretty spectacular to see in action. The phonological form, right, or elements also have to be acquired. So if the phonological features are very, very complex, let's say, those words aren't going to be acquired early on. The onomatopoeia words like boom or vroom or crash or moo, those are the words where you see a real clear relationship between the words and their reference, what it represents. So the word is the symbol. If the symbol out of my mouth is boom, and that is representing something that crashes, because there's that relationship there, those words are going to be learned a bit easier than words where they're just completely abstract and there's no relationship between the word and its referent or what it's referring to. Okay. And it also, word learning also, and semantic development also has to do with not only their initial exposure, but subsequent exposure. So they're drawing on so many sources of context to help them to develop and refine the internal representation of what words mean, what these symbols mean. And so the more exposure they have across different contexts where we have varying contexts, but the meaning remains stable, then children are going to be more likely to have a better understanding of those words and then to use those words. And then you could take a look at some of the different scenarios that are important and predict word learning as well. And then the last part here is this idea of a semantic network, right? A person's semantic network by definition, sort of like how there are these connective, neurolinguistically speaking, neuroconnective ties between concepts, so the meanings of words, but also the sounds of words. So you might see a lot of P words that are organized closely in a network, what we call a semantic network. But you also might see groups of words or meanings that are categorized by their meaning, because they're all animals or all, different types of furniture. So by category, for example. And so semantic networks and how we organize meanings and how we organize symbols based on their meaning or their sounds really help to explain. It's how we explain how we access words as quickly as we do. Okay. You can read about the idea of spreading activation. That's something that we talk more in depth about in 225 or psycholinguistics, psychology of language. Believe it or not, words that we have access to, that we understand, that we use, that we're exposed to, in essence, is an element or a reflection of gender, right? You can read through this very interesting section there as well. Okay. So finally, last but not least, we have this idea of pragmatics. Pragmatics is about language use. It involves acquiring the rules that govern how language is used as a social tool. So what are the things that we are depending on early on? What are those building blocks that we see develop? Well, we are using language for different communicative functions, and that's an important one for you to understand. So we'll talk about that. We're also developing different conversational skills. So being able to maintain a topic and go back and forth, taking turns, right? Those are all elements of how we're using language, and those skills develop starting early on. And then our real sensitivity to what we call extra linguistic cues. So paying attention to tone or facial expression or body posture. Those are all things that help us to understand the meaning of language, but those are all considered extra linguistic factors or cues. So let's take a peek in terms of communicative function, right? So by definition, it's the intention or what the purpose of language is. Sometimes we use language to regulate. Sometimes we use language as an interactional tool. Sometimes we use language to express imagination. Sometimes we use language just to give information. These are what we call different communicative functions. And it is absolutely imperative that children are developing the ability to use language across functions, right? We don't want, if we had a young child who was only using language in an imaginative way, that would be a red flag. That would be concerning. That same is true if they were only using language in a regulatory or a personal manner. So we want to acknowledge and understand what it means to use language for these different communicative functions, right? Here they are named and then also described or defined here. And we know that this is a typical part of children's early language development. In terms of their conversations, right? The back and forth between with another person, children have this robust representation of what we call a schema, which really has to do with cognition. And it has to do with what we're internalizing and how we're organizing conversational skills. So the schema or the organizational structure of a conversation, as an example, has to do with how we initiate the conversation, how we establish that topic, how we change topics or turns, how we maintain or shift the topic or maintain or shift our turn. So these are all aspects that young children are able to do on a macro structural, right, level in terms of conversation. And they're important that you're aware of those. All right, and here we have, again, some other examples. And you should read about joint attention. It's a very, very important part of a conversational schema, and it's where it all starts. Finally, we had this idea of sensitivity to extra linguistic cues, as I just mentioned. So what are they? Things like posture, gesture, facial expression, eye contact, proximity or closeness that, to somebody, if two people are standing very close to one another, we're going to assume that they know one another quite well. And then we're going to be sort of anticipating that the language they're using would represent that, right? If we had two people standing very close to each other, but having an exchange that seemed very formal or as if they didn't know one another, that would be that would be mixed signals, and that would be very difficult for a young child to interpret and make sense of, right? And so those are all very, very important to developing our conversational skills. Things like temperament, and you could read about this, right? Or how we, react to situations, we're going to impact, as well as our social and cultural exposures and contexts and experiences. All of those things will dictate sort of how we use language, what the expectations are around using language, and what the rules are, those unwritten rules. Mostly they are social and culturally specific.